Yes, baby girl. Hello, everyone. Let's make sure that we have everything in. Okay, we are in. Welcome, everybody. We already have a couple of people. I don't know if it's from YouTube, from Twitch, or from X, but either way, welcome, everybody. And TikTok is slowly picking up pace, so that we're finally doing it in like a normal hour, which is great. Let me make this silent. Perfect. So welcome to the simulation talk number 61. I'm pretty sure that most people here are regulars, but to all the newcomers, this channel mostly revolves around the simulation hypothesis. My name is Danny, and I'm claiming to have found proof to believe in the simulation, and we're meeting here on the daily. Emily, good to see you, to discuss the discovery, science, religion, spirituality, philosophy, and a lot of other fun things. Emily Moyer, which you can find her podcast on YouTube, did a couple of interviews for her show. It was a lot of fun, so go check her out. Good to see you here, Emily. By the way, everybody who are here from YouTube, if you want to give a thumbs up, give it a like. The live would be super helpful to get the live out there. And finally, we have some traction on TikTok. Wind Spirit is in the house. Slow start, but we'll get there. Let's see what we got here. Roxy. Okay. No thanks. Episode 316. There's this. 83. Okay, so we can duplicate this. How do we do this? Okay, I'll figure this out later. They always change some things. Yeah, they always change some things. Oh well. For now, we're here, we're live. Welcome, everybody. Cheryl, the real G Money. What's up? So yesterday we actually had somewhat of a religious discussion with somebody who insisted that Jesus is the only way towards the light and he will save us all. And I actually personally don't really have that much of an issue with that attitude until it gets to the part of there is no other way. And I'm not condescending you and not threatening you, but or else. So that part is when I lose interest. Any updates on the console? How are you, la la la? What do you mean by updates? As far as new discoveries, as far as the video about it, all of the above, which one are you talking about? Welcome, everybody. What are you referring to specifically? All of the above? Yeah. New discoveries, not yet. Video is coming along. Hopefully be out soon. You've seen something similar. Please tell me about it. That's fascinating. To anybody who doesn't know, the console is a computer console that I'm now seeing on the molecule every time I ingest it. Oh, and for all the newcomers, 1 second. One thing that is maybe important to mention, the last week was so busy that I keep trying to catch up with everything. I'm barely making it for these lives on time. So apologies for that. How are you, Beth? Good to see you. Thank you for the likes. Welcome, everybody. I was curious to hear more about it. Well, yeah, there's the new video is going to be on its way, and there's no new big discovery so far. I am going to try and see how it connects to the laser. But if you want to tell me details either here or email me, I would love to hear more details. You can email me to lasersimulationx@gmail.com. Mine is like a control board of a spaceship or something, but with moving parts, rotating parts, but it always is one place. I can do it from different angles. I can interact with it. There's a red grid around it. That's super interesting. And but you can keep saying things here. That would be super interesting to share with other people. First of all, it definitely sounds like the console that I'm saying, or at least the specs you're describing are the same. No, you're not hijacking the stream at all. I would love to hear more about that. I think it's a super important thing to talk about. And Emily is saying, I have a friend who did a massive dose of Aya in one of the pyramids and says he was presented with a control panel, which he believes he used to reset the matrix. See, I don't know about the last part, but I'm convinced that he was presented. The experience that things reset, it's actually pretty common, and you don't need the console to experience that. Not sure if you want to give me the details, Emily, as to why your friend thinks that, but just so you know that actually one of these things, this experience seems to be embedded in the, if you read this book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss by Dennis McKenna, about his account with what it's like to be Terence McKenna's brother and their experiences in La Chorrera. This is the central experience is describing in La Chorrera, that it feels like they were resetting history. So that's a very common theme. My hands can interact with the red grid. They feel and look different. Interesting. There's a language written on my hand when I am interacting with it. Do you feel it physically as well, no matter how slightly? And if so, what does it feel like? Because I talked about it before and I want to see if it's similar. To all the newcomers who are not familiar, a few years ago, I've discovered that if you project a diffracted laser on the surface and ingest what is called the spirit molecule, you will see code running in surfaces behind the laser. And this has now been replicated over 1,000 times. The code is extremely coherent, and I am in contact with some of the leading researchers in the field. Does not mean that all of them agree with me, but it's an interesting ongoing conversation. What do you get when you drop a piano down a mine shaft? A flat miner. Nice. Dads are in the house. Wait, I'm trying to wave at people. He keeps liking it. Yes, Booba. Relax, Booba. Oh, and your wrist feels different, like foreign in my body. Not of this world. Welcome. Anybody who joined on YouTube, if you can give the like, if you can give the live a like, that'll help the like tremendously. Relax, Booba. You can't go. You're gonna go soon. I just took you, Booba. Candy. What's up, Government Corp Watch? Relax, Boo. Here, play with this. The dogs are going crazy today. Interesting. You start right down the neck, and my hands relax into a strange position, unnatural. So like kind of like into a weird position. I see. Yeah, it would be interesting to exchange these ideas in the language specifically, because I also had people who recreated it, and it would be interesting to see. So to all the people who are not familiar with this channel, I'm going to repeat it one more time because a few more people showed up on TikTok. This channel mostly revolves around the simulation hypothesis. My name is Danny, and I'm claiming to have found proof that we live in a simulation. And we meet here on the daily to discuss the discovery, the experiment, as well as science, religion, spirituality, and philosophy in general. What I discovered a few years ago is that if we project a diffracted laser on the surface and ingest a particular molecule that I cannot name on this live chat, you will see code running in surfaces. And this observation has now been replicated over 1,000 times worldwide. And we're here talking about it every day. What's up, Becky? Let's talk about plasma. I'm all down to talk about plasma. The language that we see in the laser is kind of like in the movie. Japanese katakana mixed with something that kind of looks like Hebrew letters and mixed with numbers from 0 to 5. Again, all of these are approximations, so give or take. It's not exactly what it looks like. It looks like an alien language. They are eating the dogs. Funny enough, all these videos popping up of all the Asians and people who are in that culture that actually say, actually they do. So, sounds about right. Okay. It's one of these crazy cases where a person who sounds like a nutcase says things that sound insane, and then later you discover, oh, these things were real. It's kind of like an Alex Jones phenomena. Because Epstein's Island was real, and frogs are gay. So, what's up, everybody? So, anybody who feels like they need a summation of the channel, again, please let me know because I can't really follow track of who's coming and who's going. I gave a couple of outlines of what we were talking about here. But if you need one, please let me know and I'll recapitulate again. So yesterday I did a chat that was pretty late, and for some reason every time I do a late chat, we always have somebody coming and trying. Well, there's a lot more Jesus people. I don't know why they don't sleep. But it was actually a very nice guy. Came on and told me about how he was addicted to drugs, and then Jesus saved him, and now he's just coming and spreading the word of the Lord. And he actually sounded like a super nice guy. But what drives me crazy is that when you get to the point of, you're trying to point out the obvious, which is like what does somebody who lives, let's say, in Tibet and is a Buddhist, and they lived a really ethical life their whole life but never heard about Jesus, what happens to them? And it's kind of this ridiculous situation where people who devoted almost no time in their life to be wholesome people, all they have to do is to believe the right idea, and all of a sudden they would be saved. Obviously it doesn't make any sense, not even the least. And even though I am aware of higher functions, including what you would call the Christ consciousness operating in the system, almost certainly the truth will not be that simplistic and favoring one idea. If anything, is just an idea fighting for its survival. I see another. Oh, Nico is in the house. Nico, you're always so generous. Thank you so much for the gifts. So happy to see you. By the way, if you feel like you do want to come on and talk again, you're more than welcome to. It was a really nice conversation, and now I have a little bit more energy and I'm more clear-minded and we can break down some of these fun topics. I actually re-listened to some of David Deutsch's idea about thermodynamics, which directly connect to quantum computation. So maybe we can break that down. But you let me know if you're interested or if you have the emotional wherewithal to deal with this today. How often do I do this? I have to leave, but we'll be back next time. Recently, not very often, because I'm doing it when I'm actually trying to run the experiment, and I feel like I've exhausted all the stuff without the more elaborate apparatus, like very powerful magnets. So at the moment, I'm not really doing it that often. There was a period in which I was doing it 7-8 times a day for over a year, at least 14 months, so quite a few times, in the thousands for sure. Let's see. Apologies that I keep jumping in and out. My dogs are just going crazy today. 1 second. We'll chime in when I get settled in. I fell asleep last night on the religious conversation. Oh yeah, I saw that you showed up. You were here for that, huh? Yeah, the religious conversation was crazy. I mean, again, it is kind of crazy how well-intentioned people slide into this, completely delusional. Like, it's crazy to me. Like, I am aware that something bigger is going on, but dude, it's like literally, hey, I'm here to tell you. Like, it's like like a mafia guy shows up. Is like, hey, I love you, so I want to make sure nothing happens to you. So better follow our ways, huh? Capiche? That's literally the whole Christian rhetoric. You want protection for your store, eh? Eh? Yeah, we don't want anything to happen to you. We don't want anything to happen to your store. So, as long as you pay your respects, you should be good. You should be good, son. Tell me where the Christian rhetoric is different than what I just said. Insane. And again, no inquisition, please. Yeah. I have to be honest. The guy is super nice. I think his name was Larry. Super nice guy. Truly. I mean this. I don't mean like, I'm not being facetious. Like, super nice guy. And I also knew that he came from love, and you can feel it in his voice. He wasn't like, preaching. He was doing a little bit of the whole reading from scripture as an answer thing. And man, I don't, like, I really feel like it's a mind virus. Like, people say this sometimes, right? But I think it's not a metaphor. I think it's truly like it's like a malignant, some kind of a structure that just towards the ability to think. Thank you. This is Cosmo playing with his toy. He's playing a song. Today, when your dogs are just out of control sometimes for no reason all day. That was today. I don't know why. Yeah, so I guess, and by the way, I told him he's always welcome to come back, and we can always discuss more, because the conversation was really in good spirit. But a friend, Kirsten, also came on and spoke, and the second she started asking him questions a little bit more critical, he said, well, some of us are led by Satan. I was like, okay. It's a framework that has evolutionary advantage when there is no scientific framework. Even when there is a scientific framework, because we do have one, and yet most people are religious. In the world, most people are religious. Then the shift to politics at one point. Oh yeah, you were here for this. Yeah. When everything else failed, all of a sudden he moved to talking about Trump somehow. I don't know. And again, and I mean this, I know it sounds like I'm just playing both sides of the game here, but I don't know how to reconcile this. Super nice guy, truly. Like, I would totally hang out with him. I don't understand how that works. This is why I'm saying it's a mind virus, because I think the person who's infected is not aware that they're infected. My dog wants to play with your dogs. He hears the squeaking. Yeah, they're going nuts. Look at them. Yeah, Zena, tell them what you want. They're adorable, but they're crazy. So yeah, and I was trying to think what can be said about that. They are very cute. They really are. And thank you. I was trying to think what can this be utilized, for, like, as a lesson for me, both as a communicator and somebody who's kind of, thinking in this space in a way that I'm trying to stay as critical as I possibly can. Wait, politics are mundane and lame, but political theories, human behavior, economics. Yeah, they're much more interesting. I agree. Until we are like Jesus, Jesus will always be destiny for men. There you go. Exhibit A. Oh man, You guys are a hoot. And then the funny thing is that I talked about it before on the live, which is that I have seen, to my surprise, some elements in the space of Jesus Christ, but he was embedded in a much larger structure. But he's there, so like that's part of the function. In other words, that was real, which was crazy to me because I would never consider that to be even a possibility, to be honest. So I had to correct course. However, and this is something Christians don't like when I point out, because I say, yes, I'm aware. And then I say, but I am aware that he's also part of a larger system. And in fact, your biblical God is only mere one of the people in the hierarchy, the gods in the hierarchy. Above all of them, there's a woman, which is very surprising. So now they say, yeah, but how do you know this? I was like, well, I was shown this. They're like, oh, well, how do you know who showed you? It's like, dude, how do you know who wrote the book? It's like, it's so insane. I actually think the Bible is a journal of various psychedelic trips. I've heard this. I'll be honest with you, I don't see that. I feel like this idea is overblown. I know Joe Rogan loves that idea. I don't think so. Because I actually think it's anything but a psychedelic experience. Because the elements that I see in that space are different in nature, seems to me, from the way that religious sentiments come about. So from what I'm hearing, this whole element of like the holy, the purity, all of that stuff, I don't see that in the psychedelic space at all. It's just like a very weird alien world, and people used to be aligned on that. Like there was no, when Strassman did the studies in the 90s, in his studies, they selected people very carefully, and even the people who came preloaded with some religious predispensations, most of them did not see angels and demons. They almost all of them saw aliens and weird creatures and things like that. So we were pretty aligned on it. I think something happened. I think something happened in this modern age where a very effective meme or a memeplex infected a lot of minds and basically made everybody override what they see and overlay what they think it is on top of it instead of allowing it to be what it is. I really think that's what's going on, because I have a very extensive experience with these substances. They do not feel like what you would describe in the Bible at all. They look completely alien. Like it's almost like trying to put a square through a triangle. That's how different it is. It's like I don't understand how people talk about that in that way. Now, is it possible that some people have a different channel that they're observing that space? Yeah, but no. People were in pretty good agreement on what it was, and then all of a sudden it became something else. So something tells me that this is just a fashion. This is like a fad of people, talking in the same way, and then it just basically it makes you want to speak that kind of speak. That's what I think is going on. In fact, Strassman himself started postulating that about, he wrote that book about prophecies in the Bible and prophecies through the spirit molecule. And I have to admit, like, I don't know what happened to him, but his critical thinking is out the window. It doesn't exist anymore. Like, literally, I don't even know. Like, it's so, what's the word? Loose. The logic is so loose. Like, you would take some phrase in the Bible that barely means what somebody experienced. Barely. And it's like somehow trying to connect them together. Yeah, I don't understand that. What is the church experiment in Harvard? I've actually never heard of it. Or maybe I have and I'm not connecting the dots. You want to tell me about it? Subconscious programming, most likely, yeah. And I don't even know if it's necessarily by somebody. Nico's in the house. How are you, my brother?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing amazing.
I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Harvard, but it was his name eludes me right now. It's the guy that came up with the setting and substance, the triple S system.
Yeah, that was Strassman, and that was in Albuquerque.
Strassman.
That was in Albuquerque.
Yeah. Oh, was it in Albuquerque?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he did the church experiment, right? Where he.
What is the church experiment?
Um, or I'm pretty sure it was Harvard. I'll look it up after, but it was
Where?
an experiment where he gave an undergraduate psychology class. He got in trouble for doing this. He took them all to church, and he gave half of them a placebo. He gave half of them mushrooms and half of them a placebo.
No,
And
that's
they
a
all
different
sat.
study. That wasn't for sure. That was, if it was mushrooms, then it was definitely not Strassman. Let me see.
Yeah, I think it was.
Is it the Mars Chapel experiment?
That might have been it. Yeah, but
Okay.
essentially, like a super high percentage of all of them said they had this like collective religious experience
How do you
while
define?
sitting.
How do they define that?
Yeah, that was something that I don't remember, but I think a lot of them said they felt um, this like Holy Spirit or something similar to that. But what it ended up, I think what he ended up deriving from it is that when you have a group of people and you have this kind of collective ritual, there is this like pretty powerful experience that comes from that, from like singing a song together in a room, and I think people were mistaking that for this, or people weren't. It's not that they were mistaking it, but people were really just describing this kind of collective experience. But I always felt like that was a really, I mean, obviously you can't do that kind of study today, but
Wait, why can't
I
you?
think it, well, I mean, I don't. I think I guess you can, but not with an undergraduate psychology class at a university. But and I think this was before this stuff was even like on the radar. This was like before it was a Schedule 1 substance. I
Yeah, it
think
was
it was mushrooms. It might have
60.
been LSD actually. Now that I think about
So
it.
I don't see the substance right now, but oh, wait a second. You're not. This was not under Timothy Leary and Richard
Oh yes,
Alpert,
it
right?
was Timothy Leary. Yes,
Oh,
it
brother,
was.
Timothy Leary like skewed so much data.
Oh,
Like,
he did.
oh yeah, he's not a good player, brother. Like he is. I don't know if you know this, but there's like a crazy. So Alex goes into that in some length in his book, The Bigger Picture. But he essentially, well, first of all, he overstepped the boundaries in such a way that was super irresponsible. Um, and basically, you can't say single-handedly. Of course, it's a very complex situation, but he contributed tremendously to all these substances to actually be classified as illegal. A lot of it is because of him, because he basically made like he threw kerosene into a fire that was already happening in a way that made the government go, okay, we don't understand it, but we're going to put a cap on this, and that was largely because of him, and because he I don't remember the exact phrase, but that whole thing when he was saying tune in, drop out, all that stuff, right? So it was like leave school, don't worry about any of that stuff, and then you had babies wandering into the streets because people were just not paying attention to anything, right? And just to illustrate like how weird his character was, and that's the most generous thing I can say. At some point, he was either broken out or so basically. Wait, was he broken out? There was some situation where he was imprisoned, and he was basically either broken out by or helped legally to get out. I don't remember the details there. By it was either, I really got to get my facts straight, but it was by some social warrior group, either Black Panthers or I don't remember exactly. I think it might have been Black Panthers, and basically, like he owed them big time. Okay, and when push came to shove, and this is not like a urban legend. This actually happened. This is not this is not contended. In order when he got caught again later, in order to get a reduced sentence, he gave them away. He gave their locations, their names, so he literally just ratted them out. So that's who the guy is.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. I had no idea. That's crazy.
Yeah, and look, I'm only relying on my experience, and I always remain very, very open-minded. But I do think that to some degree, after you do something for thousands of times, maybe it doesn't make you an authority, but it definitely makes me a good understander of that space and what's possible in that space. That I can claim without a problem, right? Um, I have a long way to go to be well versed in the details of the neuroscience, but I think only having the neuroscience on board without understanding the intricacies of what is possible in these spaces, For example, I always say that any researcher who's never done these things is not a true researcher of these things. He has no idea. They have no idea what they're talking about. Okay, because you have to like experience it for yourself to be able to understand. In addition to that, as a side point, not even related to specifically to the study you're mentioning or any other study, this tendency that science has to take what they call mass hallucination. So notice they just coined the term that just makes it sound like they know what it is. It's just kind of like placebo. It's just placebo. You have no idea how it happens. What is the just for? What is the word just doing there, right? So mass hallucination. Okay, but how it happens? Well, it's mass hallucinations. Like, okay, what does that mean? Like, what? How is this happening? Like, if this is not proof for you that something objective is going on, I don't know what it is. But what they did is they coined a term that basically sweeps it under the rug, right? So whenever people try to dial, like to lower the status of these experiences to match some kind of a frame they already had, in other words, this is trying to fold it into the physicalist perspective that the mind is an arising property of the brain. We don't know how, but eventually we will. Of course you won't, because that's impossible. But the assumption is that one day you will. And then basically people just say, oh, well, how can we explain it in terms of what we already think? Versus look at the obvious, which is like, wait a second, you have 10 people saying the same thing? How is that happening? Or at least talk about it in terms of how is the information in the brain reproducing exactly the same image, which is equivalent to what we see in the physical world. Because we know that the physical world is essentially a shared hallucination. Like, it's not what the physical world looks like, obviously, but something inside of each and every one of us arrived at some consensus, or consensus reality that we all share to a degree, right? And these analyses are extremely crude, usually, and they don't include any of the little nuanced information that I'm talking about now. They're just talking about the observation. Subject saw A, B, C. It's so crude, it's crazy. Like it has to have these, you know what I mean? Like it has to have this description of the intricacies of what in fact is going on. Yeah.
Have you heard of that scientist that is he's essentially creating like a device that attaches to your spine, and it titrates a very careful amount of the spirit molecule into your spinal cord. And
no, I've never heard of this. Actually,
Yeah,
Chase
so
that just came on, I think he was talking about some other device that they installed, like in the context of Neuralink. But what you're describing, I've never heard before. So can you describe a little bit?
I'll dig up the scientist. He did a podcast with Hamilton Morris. I don't know if you follow Hamilton Morris, but
I'm familiar, of course.
yeah, it was really interesting because he was describing essentially like, we're at this very careful, like, so reality is this very carefully controlled kind of experience, DMT trip, right? Like what we're experiencing now
just don't forget, don't try not to say that word because they might flag us.
Gotcha.
Just say the spirit molecule.
This very carefully modulated experience by this chemical compound. And what he was saying is that you can actually, if you carefully titrate the amount of this compound, you can hit another steady state. But when you're essentially partaking of, some type of delivery mechanism, whether it's oral or through some smoke, it's essentially this transient experience where your body's not going through your mind isn't going through a steady state, but it's going through this transient. And so he's trying to essentially come up with a stable state of consciousness that you can hit by carefully titrating the chemistry, which is extremely interesting. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's yeah, I don't know why. I forgot why I really mentioned that. But,
No, well, listen, it's fascinating all by itself. So let me get this straight. The tap goes why into the spine, by the way? I didn't quite understand.
I think he was talking about the just, I guess it crosses the blood-brain barrier faster, or if it's directly in the system as opposed to having to go through some other biological pathway. So I'm not entirely sure why, but it's supposed to be it's supposed to help you hit steady state, and it's dynamic. It's dynamically like modulating, which is really really cool and futuristic. But yeah.
Spinal. Let me look it up. This is super interesting. You said spinal. Yeah. In the meanwhile, Chase, how are you, brother?
Hey, Danny. Hey,
I,
Nico. Yeah, doing well. I'm curious, Nico. Are you just referring to the extended state proportional integral derivative device that Gallimore and Strassman proposed, and they
This sounds
no,
familiar.
no, it
It
says
sounds
spinal
familiar. I
tap
mean,
lumbar puncture of what
yeah,
continues.
that might be it, Morpheus. I mean, you used to essentially describe the PID, but yeah, it's essentially a controller that's carefully modulating the levels of it. And I heard a few. Hamilton Morris did a podcast with him about a year ago, and I heard him talk about like essentially creating this extended state, like you were mentioning. So it's probably very similar or inspired by that work, because I know Strassman is like an OG in the space.
Yeah. No,
yeah,
Strassman.
it's curious.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say I haven't heard of Hamilton. I'm going to have to dig him up, or perhaps I have. Maybe I've read about Hamilton or references to him in Gallimore and Strassman's work and elsewhere. But yeah, I mean that essentially that's what the PID device does for Gallimore and Strassman's experiment that they proposed, and of course they've used that now in London, right? Imperial College and elsewhere, I believe.
No, I think it's
3 or
intravenous.
4
I think in the Imperial it's intravenous. I don't think it's to the spine, but maybe I'm
Right.
wrong.
Well, that was the bit, because the wording that Nico used sounded like he was unsure if it was direct to the spine. He said something along the lines. Forgive me, Nico. I'm going to paraphrase, but
I might be mistaken. I think you're right, but I remember listening to it and hearing something about like there being like a pretty fast feedback loop. I don't know if intravenous is still able to give you that level of control, but it sounded like it was spinal. But I may be wrong on that.
It feels to me like if that would be effective, that's the only thing they would use, because something that Alex also talked about. He was one of the subjects in the study in the Imperial. I think he still is, and he said that it's not like they tell you in the media where they turn it off and it turns off. Of course not. Like when they turn it off, you still have like good 20 minutes when you're still there. Like it's almost like you just smoked basically. So it's definitely the intravenous in the study. But I wonder if there is a superior method, why wouldn't they use that? Because that sounds like it will be amazing. You know, if you just turn it off and it just turns off, that's crazy. Maybe because it's too risky. Imagine if somebody starts flailing around while the thing is in their spine. Maybe that's why.
Well, the thing with there being an alternative method that is, theoretically better. The method now, the PID device intravenously is ideal. Onset is within 7 seconds tops, and duration totally depends on that steady state. I think the feedback loop is fine. I haven't heard any feedback from the team at Imperial or elsewhere that they were having significant issues with that. I think it's pretty instantaneous as is. As far as
No. The problem is in the way down. So it's not, they never said that it was an issue because everybody handled it. But Alex said very clearly that from the second they turn it off, if something goes wrong, from the second they turn it off, it doesn't just turn off for you. It takes like
no, of
20
course.
minutes. Yeah.
I mean, if you have whatever 50 milligrams in your system or 70 milligrams, I mean, it's going to take 20 minutes.
So the question is if the spinal one can potentially turn it off immediately, that would definitely be superior. But I don't know if that was achieved. That is interesting. I really want to look into it now.
And then it becomes well.
The what?
Yeah, that's curious. Hamilton. What was Hamilton's first name?
Yeah, his name is Hamilton Morris. He's a famous journalist in this space, and he's probably done. You've probably seen the Pharmacopoeia series. He does a lot of really high end production work in this space for documentaries and stuff. But his podcast is amazing. He brings on all the OGs in the space to talk about the pharmacokinetics of all these. Out of this new third wave of psychedelic research that's going out there, he's I think there's a lot of like interesting controversy in the space because, you know, the first wave of it was kind of, I guess, the Hoffman wave, and then I don't know. You mentioned like the bad players of Leary and maybe like the second wave of it, but this third wave of essentially it being sold as this cure-all magic, you know, therapeutic is really interesting. But all of these like tiny modulation, like, you know, they're varying nowadays. The research is really getting to creating receptor modulators to modulate this experience and kind of create a more carefully controlled kind of stimulation of these receptors. Specifically, the 5-HT2A receptor is kind of the receptor they're targeting for this. But I know that this device is supposed to kind of give you that ability to hit that receptor and stimulate it in a very consistent way.
And just to point out that at least specifically with the Imperial study and the one that is starting now in San Diego, the focus is actually not on the therapeutic part, but on the ontological question, whether the space is actually real, which is, and Kel just pointed out the Joe Rogan Experience, episode 1615, with Hamilton Morris. Hey, Cosmo, relax.
Oh, appreciate that. Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but don't be crazy.
Occurred to me that I likely have, the name likely sounds familiar because I've seen the pod.
Yeah, it's oh, Jesus Christ.
I don't believe I have any books by Morris, but no, I appreciate the.
Yeah, I don't think he's publishing books. I think he does publish he has published a few papers or patents, but he's not like a rigorous academic. He's just a journalist, but he has a lot of academics on. I believe Dennis McKenna. He has a really great podcast with Dennis McKenna on the shaman pharmaceuticals. That whole kind of movement of kind of productizing like ayahuasca as a therapeutic. Did Galloway write a book, a kind of textbook on this space?
Yeah, he's got alien information theory. He also has I have both of his books. I can't think of the second book.
Reality Switch Technologies.
Right, Reality Switch Technologies. Yeah, both great books. You know, I mean, Andrew. I think Danny knows Andrew relatively well, and yeah, Andrew strikes me as he's really sharp. You know, he really, I think, brings attention to the chemical pharmacology, specifically with respect to this tryptamine, and also the neuroscience behind it. You know, I find it fascinating what he has to say about the default mode network and what happens with the molecule. And I'm especially interested in the study at Imperial on the ontology of these things. But you know, I mean, looking at this from a what's the word? The word escapes me. To treat anxiety, depression, PTSD, those things.
Oh, therapeutic stuff. Yeah.
Emotional health, right? I mean, I think the reason it works is because it exposes you to a broader reality. I mean, that's arguable, but that's my opinion. I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, I think that's the real gold nugget here in this entire endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really amazing kind of potential in the space. I mean, I went pretty deep on this. I'm a chemical engineer, so I was like very interested in designing molecular scaffolds that can kind of modulate these experiences. One of the projects that I'm working on right now is taking Alexander Shulgin's body of work, him and his collaborators, and using an AI model to kind of predict these experiences, predict what experiences would be if you synthesize novel compounds, right? So there's like a kind of a generative AI component to it as well. But it's so hard because these experiences are so subjective, and you're using their field notes as kind of outputs. Do you want to say something, Danny? It looks like you wanted to say something about that.
Oh no, the dogs are just. I'm like, ugh.
Oh,
They
okay.
can't-
My
But
mine are in the background too. Nico, by the way, I'm a double E and an ME. But you know, I'm curious. You mentioned developing novel compounds, and you said something else, and then dogs were mentioned. And I have our dog is nearly on top of me here. She wants to play, so I completely lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Continue with what you were saying, please.
Yeah, so I mean,
It'll come to me.
I mean so there's this idea of a structure activity relationship, right? So if you have a new molecular structure, it can bind to these receptors and give you, and binding isn't just this kind of lock-key type of relationship that we used to think of, right? We now know that there's different strengths of binding, different electrical kind of modulations at these receptors, right? Where, a compound like, I don't really want to. It's so hard because I can't really name chemical compounds, can I? With
you can allude to that if they're not very well known. The algorithm won't catch it, but if like the really big ones, the known ones, then just allude to them. So that way.
Yeah, so like lysergic acid versus like a dimethyltryptamine or a tryptamine is going to have very different binding affinities, but also just stimulation of these receptors. But I mean, kind of going back to your original question of like, I've talked to some scientists that are working on transcranial magnetic stimulation, right? So they have this really powerful ability to scan the brain and also see areas that are downregulated and just stimulate it with a magnetic field, right? And they've seen cases where people improve, and they have enough trends to know that, okay, well, depression is this kind of downregulation of this electrical circuit in the prefrontal cortex, in the lower prefrontal cortex, and they're able to see OCD is, slightly to the right of that, and anxiety is in this very similar kind of like limbic region of the brain. And
So whatever the mechanism is broken is like similar. By the way, before you continue, the two compounds you mentioned, the mechanism is not in both of them the 5-HT2 receptor. It's not.
It's a two. Yeah, they both bind to the 2A. They're likely also binding to other compounds as well, but one of them, the lysergic acid is binding much stronger than like a dimethyltryptamine, from at least from the literature that I've alluded to in the 5-HT2A. It seems to be the consensus.
Okay.
And so anyways, but yeah, so there's these like the idea is like, so there's this like serotonin hypothesis, which is like, okay, serotonin is supposed to stimulate these circuits of the brain, and when you study these diseases like depression or anxiety or OCD or other types of diseases, you see that there are certain circuits of the brain that are understimulated. And the state of the art right now that's accepted is, okay, we'll give them serotonin reuptake inhibitors and just stimulate it with serotonin, and over some long period of time, some people respond well, some people don't. But it seems from my hypothesis is, and I think many others, is that if you take a compound that stimulates globally your serotonin receptors at a very high intensity and at a synchronicity with the rest of your mind, you can kind of like kickstart a dead battery or a dead circuit and kind of stimulate it. And that's why there's this emphasis, I think, on like this integration component to it, right? Because it's like you can have this really amazing stimulating experience, but you can also fall back into this same hole of depression and anxiety. But I think I think there is this interesting component of like, working through, taking that plasticity and that stimulation and trying to like work through it with time and able to kind of overcome a lot of these very stubborn, like, treatment resistant depression or anxiety and et cetera. So I think it's just like a kind of a strong, like, I don't want to call it like an electroconvulsive therapy, like, but it almost is, as you're stimulating these circuits that have been just kind of turned off. That's at least how I view it. I don't know if you have an alternative perspective.
So I actually have some thoughts on that. First of all, in the context of just doing like a public announcement, I've seen on the Huberman podcasts, one of his episodes was specifically about depression. and I've had clinical depression for a lot of times for a lot of periods in my life. And he said that there was recent studies that actually suggested very strongly that omega 3s, specifically the ones with a high concentration of EPA, taken at least what amount with what would amount to between 1 and 2 grams of EPA a day for at least a week, will actually start rewiring the system in a way that will be much more effective than any SSRI. And because it's so simple, you can get it in any vitamin shop. I was like, hey, why not? And I tried it and it worked. So anybody who wants to try it, I highly recommend it. It has to have a high concentration of EPA. It's not going to work without it, because not all omega-3s are created equal. So make sure you look in the back. As long as the EPA content is at least 700 and more, you can get that. And then you can have 2 pills a day, which amounts to 1.4 grams a day. And it actually makes a big difference. It's kind of crazy. I couldn't believe it. So that's just on the just purely chemical side. Now, as connecting between what Chase said and what Nico you just said, I think it's the looking at it from two different perspectives. Like, you're looking at it from the neurochemical perspective, which is a very important way of like a thing to understand, because ultimately these are some either misfirings or some systems that are just basically broken down in the brain. But at least from what the studies in Johns Hopkins imply, they basically point to exactly what Chase said, which doesn't necessarily is the opposite of what you're saying, but the perspective is they realize that all the good changes that happen to people on at least the mushroom study, I don't want to say the active ingredient, but the mushroom study, with addiction, with depression, the good changes only occurred if people had what they categorized as a transcendent experience. So it's exactly what Chase is saying, which means if they had the experience but didn't report the transcendent experience, they wouldn't exhibit the positive changes. But if they would, in like 80 or 90% of cases, they would have the positive changes that are long lasting. It lasted for in the slightly more longitudinal study they've done for at least a year, which is crazy, right? So that actually points to the fact that the content of the experience actually matters a lot. Now, you can translate probably the content to the third person observation of what in fact changes in the brain, but I think that's more of a philosophical outlook on like which one should we look at. I think we should look at both, because ultimately what people report is a strong data point. Sometimes you can just fix it by trying to steer internally, and if you can find ways to help people steer internally into that experience, you won't need to understand what is the chemical composition. You can just induce in the brain. Does that make sense, or do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've actually looked into that the study by Rolland at Johns Hopkins with mushrooms, and I do think that like the intensity of the experience is a huge variable, especially at like kind of some people just get fixed, right? They have this amazing experience, and the way that they benchmark it is like they say that it's equivalent to giving birth to a child, or like that. Apparently, like that's like the bar for human experience, right? Is childbirth is mind blowing. And they rank it similar to that, but apparently, like some people get fixed immediately and others don't, and I don't know if it's and I think you mentioned like the experiences or the intensity plays a role. I think of it as like a electrical circuit where like a strong charge can really kickstart a system, but I also there's also this controversy behind microdosing, right? And whether that is therapeutic. And it doesn't have this easy, so that's not an easy, solution. It takes a lot of therapy in addition to that. And that's almost like a small trickle charge to the circuit that you're able to kind of give you some juice to kind of work through your issues. But I think at the end of the day, from my perspective, and I could be entirely wrong from all this, it's about trying to turn on certain circuits again, right? And You mentioned the omega-3 things. I also have met people that have just gotten it through exercise, and I've seen studies where like exercise really does stimulate the brain and turns on a lot of this these circuits and stuff. But for some people, it also doesn't. So I don't know if there's like a one kind of size fits all framework, but I've been a big fan of the electrical circuit view, which they're calling like, and I'm not a huge fan of transcranial magnetic stimulation. I think it's a little bit dangerous. But
Really?
even though
You think that's more dangerous than probing the brain?
No, I don't think it. I don't think it's more dangerous. But I do think it's it's like I do think our brain is kind of sensitive, and these magnetic fields are large. And I mean, it's a 6 hertz like oscillation, which does turn off or turn on different parts of the brain. But I don't know. I like to play on the side of.
I want to ask you a clarifying question from a philosophical perspective because I think it will illuminate this. But before I do, Chase, I saw that you were muted and unmuted again. Did you want to say something, brother? Before.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Danny. Yeah, I just had a few things to say on what you two were discussing.
No.
So when it comes to the dosage amount of these various molecules, right? Whether it's the study at Hopkins or the things that are happening at Imperial right now, I think the data is pretty clear with respect to participants and in the study specifically, not those that are happening at Imperial, but the other studies. When it comes to mental health, I think it's pretty clear that those that do, like you said, Danny, those that have a breakthrough experience, those that have something they describe as transcendental or like childbirth or like dying and rebirth or whatever, they rank them in the top 5 experiences, if not the top experiences of their lives, right? Those people are likely not to step backward, right, or require further therapy. I think the data supports that pretty well. The other thing that I would say is, and one of you mentioned Hoffman's work earlier, I believe, and in thinking about how Hoffman is approaching this general kind of stream of thought, having these transcendental experiences can really shift your worldview. So the individual has the capacity to change these circuits, right? I think that's another part of the conversation. And I'm not saying that the work that you're doing, Nico, is not important or anything at all. It's helping us better understand what's happening. But I think we're really in our infancy in really truly understanding what's happening. When you see the intersection of all these bodies of work across these different fields, it's telling us something more grand. Pardon me.
That actually leads me exactly to my question to you, Nico. But I guess let me just introduce Grippy Toes real quick. How you doing? You wanted to say something? Okay.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm just gonna. I'll be just like a fly on the wall, listening.
Sure.
I've been here before. Remember?
Yeah. No, that's why I wanted to see if you had something to say. Of course, feel free to stay.
I am very much a student of this whole. I'm a student, right? So I could be wrong. Really, where my motivation from all this comes in is I'm a chemical engineer, so I understand chemical systems. And especially the behavior of complex systems responding to a chemical input, right? The human mind is kind of the holy grail of that, right? It's extremely complex. And the way that I've been approaching this is kind of like, okay, well, what body of work, who has done the most robust, collection of data on this? And it's such a complex system. And I've tried to rely on Shulgin's work a little bit, but more importantly, in talking to a lot of people in the space, the big question, and this is something where I don't know if you guys are familiar with Brian I believe his last name is Rothman, from University of Chapel Hill. He made this.
Oh,
He
sounds
he
familiar.
made something called super LSD, right? Where he essentially looked at X-ray crystallography data of LSD binding to the 5-HT2A receptor, and saw, okay, well, if I can now, I now have a three-dimensional model. Now, if I can generate a lot of these different molecules that have an experience that is not transcendental, right, but stimulates this receptor in a certain way, can I have the therapeutic effects without this, transcendental experience? And this is a highly controversial topic because
Yeah.
a lot of people say no, it's a part of the healing, it's a part of the experience.
Yeah, I'm
this
not sure.
mental
I'm not
shift.
so sure. I had a similar thought about the visual acuity in mushrooms. So, if you can isolate whatever the function is that allows for the visual acuity, and then without all the psychedelic explosion, I mean, you have the perfect pill for people who don't see that well. It's amazing. Like you just take it in the morning, and you know what I mean.
I have friends that are suffering tremendously, and I try to kind of, say, hey, can you talk to someone about it? And they're so turned off by the intensity of these experiences that they'll never explore this therapeutic option. And many people fall in that bucket.
Yeah.
But a big part of understanding these receptors and this, the brain and the circuitry, it kind of, there are, as you said, Morpheus, we're in the infancy of understanding all of this, and it's kind of like, as an engineer, I try to approach it and view it as a system, as as like a PID controller, right? Like,
So that's
here's a black box.
So this is
What
perfect.
inputs-
This I really want to ask you a question there because that's exactly about that.
Can I just say one
Yeah,
thing?
yeah,
too?
yeah, of course.
Like, again, like I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering, a master's in mechanical engineering. I've worked in emergent tech for the last 20 years.
Zeno.
Like, I understand approaching this from a systems
Zeno,
perspective,
relax.
but at I think how do I format this the best way? I think everybody finds their interest in a topic in a different way. And I've been focused on instrumentation and control systems. I've worked for NASA. I've worked for a lot of the auto manufacturers in recent years, automation and stuff like that. And I came to this interest in this specific tryptamine through research on what people call paranormal and supernatural extraordinary experiences, UAP, UFOs, ghost encounters, alien abduction, stuff like that. And the reason that I was interested in that is because I had experiences before discovering the molecule. And the reason that the molecule fell into my research was because people were reporting entity encounters, classic alien abduction encounters, out-of-body experiences, aspects of near-death experiences. So, these bodies of work, that I think. Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to derail the conversation here, but
No,
Danny's-
it's literally along the lines of exactly my point that I'm trying to make, which is that you were talking about it in terms of the feedback mechanism that gives you some information, and then what we did in the modern era is that we completely eliminated the observer's any as a reliable input data point at all. So basically, we completely eliminated it as even anything to look at as a potential data point, right? Only in terms of the researcher would ask you questions, and then they would kind of listen to your answers, and then they will formulate their own, what they think they understood from what you said and from what because people are confused. So I'm gonna decide what they said, right? It's a very obviously it's a caricature version of that, but I'm trying to make a point to illustrate this. So I'm making an extreme version of this. But is it possible in your mind? My original question to you, Nico, was it's a two-parter. The first part of the question is: do you accept that idealism is possible? In other words, that mind is actually the fundamental thing, and then what we see as the the physical things, they're essentially just a third-person perspective of some solidified structures within this thing that is called mind or mental. And the second part of the question is, if yes, or even if it's a possibility in your mind, would it not be possible that by adopting this frame philosophically, we are now looking at the problem from the other side, and we're saying, wait a second, maybe some things we don't need to fly blind by just seeing the interactions, electrical interactions, but maybe we can get a very concrete data point by people's experiences under certain circumstances that will allow us to actually circumvent and bypass all the process that would be required to like trial and error thousands of times, but just go directly to, it's almost like somebody turned on the light in the room. It's like, hey, it's just right there. Just go there. That's where it is. And then you aim there, and then you see what happens in the brain from a third person perspective when you're there. And that's the only thing you're analyzing versus trying all the things on the way, which, yeah, you might discover also things along the way, but I feel like that's a much more effective way of doing it. And I do feel that one of the reasons that we can't do it that way is because any serious grant to from any serious university or a private entity that invests in a scientist to do a particular research always adheres to this like much more, kind of like human experience removed kind of study, which is just like you're just looking at it from the outside, always like from the outside versus also taking into account what is the experience itself. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, I mean, I guess, were you asking, like, can the mind itself kind of overcome the matter? Like, is there...
No, I'm saying something much more radical, which is that there is nothing else. So basically the Hoffman model or the Bernardo Kastrup model, right? Idealism. But I mean it not just... So you start from the philosophical proposition, but you allow it to trickle down to the technical world, where you say, okay, let's postulate, let's say you're operating under the assumption. So you're no longer operating under the assumption that there's some kind of a physical brain that somehow gives rise to consciousness. You put that aside for a second, you postulate a different world in which consciousness is not just fundamental in the universe, but it is the universe. So like whatever mental is, whatever experience itself is, not minds yet, but experience, that is what space-time is. That is what existence is. And then just like when you look at the brain from a third-person perspective, i.e. somebody else's brain, that's the third-person representation of what it's like to be from a first-person experience inside of that brain. The universe is the third-person observation of what the universal mind looks like when you look at it from a boundary, from outside of a boundary, which is like, we can talk about what these boundaries mean, but Bernardo Kastrup does some work of approaching that. And he means it in a very technical way. He doesn't mean it in like an esoteric kind of like philosophical way. It's just like, no, there's these boundaries that you can describe. You can talk about them either in informational terms or in system terms. And then you say, well, if the universe is mental, the experience also holds data. In fact, it might be the best consolidation data system possible. So like if you're looking at a frame, right now I'm looking at a frame, and if let's say something can record my experience, the kitchen in front of me, the plant in front of me, all of these things, it contains a lot of zip file data that if you want to extrapolate, you can, but you don't have to because you have this picture. The amount of binary bits, the amount of information it will need to actually put it on a hard drive, as far as not just the image of it, but all the information about this state is enormous. I'm talking about the dimensions of each thing, the interactions of all the particles, like all of that, like everything that gives rise to this. The amount of data is insane, right? But if I just take the image, but then I have a Rosetta Stone on the other end, that's something that wants to extrapolate this data. In other words, if I see green, if the image contains green, it's like, okay, I know that green means this wavelength. Great. So I know that. So that's a data point embedded in the fact that it's green. So, and then everything, what if everything is like this, which is this is like a frozen data set in a form of an image, in a form of an experience that comes at you every frame per second. So I don't mean it metaphorically, I mean it technically. Is it possible that there might be a research process that would actually yield more fruit with a lot less effort because you take into account the experience itself? So I'll give you an example. In the study that we're talking about with the mushrooms, you can say the experience, a transcendent experience. And then you can ask, okay, what does that mean? So in terms of this the interplay between the first person and the third person, how do we describe the transcendent experience? So first of all, they do have, and you said you read the paper, so you're familiar. They basically kind of found some key elements in what it means, and one of them is comparing it to a very meaningful event in somebody's life. That's one data frame, right? A data point, comparing it to that. But they have other data points, which is like how, how moving it is, how long the positive effects that stay with it. But I'm pretty sure we can eventually describe this experience, what people will call the divine, in terms of what it might mean in the context of if the universal mind is a real thing. Like, what are you interacting with the greater scale mind in a way that makes you connected with the flow of the system, right? And are you actually aligning with it, or are you going in some disjointed form with it? And maybe that's what creates a dissonance and the depression and all of these things. And I do think that something there actually holds a very important seed that will circumvent a lot of unnecessary steps in research, just because at the moment we don't think there's another way to do it. We just kind of like, the only way to do it is just to kind of trial and error infinite things until you land on something that might work.
Nico, I've got to jump here in a minute. I'm at like 4%. I need to plug up. But I wanted to just kind of point out the reason that I brought all that up, the bottom line for me that I wanted to convey to you just as an idea, was that high-level component of what Danny just said. It's this concept of idealism, or rather, there being no true objective reality, and everything that we define as objective is actually subjective. Right? That's essentially the idea. And these experiences give you glimpses into literally other realities that have been confirmed by other people. Hundreds of thousands of other anecdotal reports. I'm working on Discover Paradox, PARADOCS.com. You can check that out. There's not a lot of information on all of the content that we've gathered so far, but essentially the project is about showing these emergent patterns between the different fields of study, the academic research, the scientific research, and then all of the anecdotal evidence that exists, and showing the emergent patterns so that we can use millions of anecdotal reports to show that these things are true, or the probability of them being true at the very least is very high. But again, kind of the gold nugget here is learning more about the nature of reality and the experience we're all having now, and what that means, period, right? So, I mean, maybe taking that idea and looking further into, if you haven't considered it already, looking further into the work of these other leading, cutting edge scientists in these various fields that are studying this, and seeing where those pieces fit together. Because, I realize there are a lot of people that haven't had experiences that have led them to question the nature of reality. A lot of us just generally accept what we learn and what we, might pick up throughout our careers. But there's a broader reality here. The things that we consider fundamental may not necessarily be broken, but there are a lot of missing pieces. And, I know we're already questioning the nature of reality in mainstream. You see this kind of cyclical thing that happens where the population of the globe shifts from thinking about what we've termed as spirituality or the nature of existence, these concepts that are, I think, in the West so firmly associated with things like Buddhism, right? But anyway, I feel like I'm just rambling here. This has been fun, guys. Hopefully it's been fun for you too.
Much love, Chase. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, Danny, I'll see you soon. Nico, it's fun to chat.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, I mean, these are amazing points and big questions. I don't know, but what I do, the way that I view this is, I view the brain in terms of the evolutionary, development of the brain, right? So we, today we have these we have a prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the most modern, latest hardware update to the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which allows us to kind of have these amazing transcendental experiences. And even with like just mindfulness meditations, you can observe the mind and observe the patterns of the mind. But the thing too is that I think we're dealing with a lot of hardware. We inherited a lot of primal hardware, right? That tries to keep us alive, that through hundreds of millions of years of evolution has been programmed on its own autopilot mode, right? Its own program to keep us alive, right? And stimulate the nervous system and trigger fight or flight responses, and whether it's anxiety or depression or whatever it is we're dealing with, or even just people are stuck in a certain mental framework and will walk their entire life operating in accordance to that framework, right? And never kind of analyze that framework themselves. And then when I hear stories about Buddhists that are in complete darkness, meditating for years and able to change the temperature of one finger relative to the other, like that makes me wonder if, like you said, the mind can really modulate everything, like, up to the point of the temperature of one finger relative to the other. I do wonder if that is possible. But
So one thing to clarify, because and I'm sorry, I really don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think this point is very important to drive home, if that's okay. The proposition, as opposed to what Chase just said, at least in again, just so I know the reference of how much you're aware of. You familiar with some of Bernardo Kastrup's work and some of Donald Hoffman's work, or not at all?
not at all.
Oh, got it. Okay, so I'll actually send you a couple of things I think that would actually be interesting to listen to, regardless. In a nutshell, before I, go down in any other rabbit holes, let's see if just my description of it will suffice, and if not, then we can go deeper. The proposition of idealism is not that the mind can influence everything. And it sounds like almost a distinction without a difference, but it's all the difference. It is mind. It is mind. So it's not that it even influences it, is that what appears to be this physical function from a third person perspective, and by the way, even for you looking on your own body, that's already a third person perspective, because you seeing the representation of what the mind is doing. But this is mental. So first, it's not that the mental perceives this physical thing. There is no physical thing. This is mental, and this is just a representation of what the mental is doing. So now, as opposed to what Chase just said, in idealism, the idea is not that there is no objective reality. That is not true. The objective reality is the state of the universal mind as a whole. That's the objective reality. And just like any other system, it has regularities, it has repeating functions, it's doing a thing that you can talk about. And the proposition is, this is where the work of Bernardo Kastrup comes in handy, because he wrote books about this, and he definitely understands the technical part of it. He worked for CERN, he's a computer scientist, but he's also a philosopher, so he understands both sides of this spectrum. And the simplest way to look at it is that you are seeing, so when you're seeing your own body, it's a representation of what the mental part, which is the fundamental part according to idealism, is doing. And therefore, understanding it from the perspective of the first person, the mental side, is actually informative, and it adds to the information of what the representation itself is doing. So, for example, just this simple function, you don't really know how you're doing it, right? You have no idea. Like, it just happens. Now, you can say, well, we know what parts of the brain are active when this is happening, right? But that's not the same as saying how you're doing this. You don't know how the thing you feel yourself to be is doing this. You have no idea. You just you wish it into existence, and it just happens. Now, because it's an integrated system, it's within the boundary of this particular fractal of the universal mind. So it's almost like a piece of the universal mind breaking apart inside like a bubble, and it creates a filament around itself. So now it perceives from inside the filament and it sees the rest of it, and it sees it as a physical world because it sees a representation of what the universal mind is doing, just like it sees the representation of other units like itself are doing, other human beings and other animals. 1 second, baby. And also itself. And now you can talk about the reality of, if this idea kind of holds water, you can talk about the functions that are occurring in both terms of what it's like to be the experience you're doing it, and also how the thing is occurring, because it's not like one is influencing the other now in this model. It's that they are the same thing, just looked at from outside the boundary and inside the boundary. That's the only difference. And it sounds like, so what? Like, what is it actually changing? Well, this is where Donald Hoffman's work come into play. He discovered in the 80s, actually, and now, he's really trending because now they kind of got on this. They got a lot of very smart people interested, so I guess that's one of the reasons. Nima Arkani Hamed is one of them, actually, as I'm sure you're probably familiar, is like a very known physicist. Basically, he discovered that if you run a simulation of any environment of any kind, well, at least the ones that they tested, of course they didn't test all the environments, but in at least in the ones that they ran, and you introduce an agent that operates in that environment that is off that environment, so obviously it's the substrate of it represents, the function of it represents the substrate it's made out of and lives on. If you run the evolutionary game from a game theoretical perspective, you will find that in 100% of the times, 100%, any being, any agent that is aware of anything beyond the reward functions will 100% of the time lose the evolutionary game to any being that is not aware of anything beyond the reward functions. So if you're aware of anything else that is outside of what is required for your immediate survival, in our case, food, reproduction, all that stuff, three-dimensional awareness, all that stuff, you will 100% of the time lose the evolutionary game to all the other agents that are not aware of anything beyond that. And this would imply that it would always be the case in any environment in a universal tapestry that all the beings, conscious agents or semi-conscious agents, will never know what the actual environment looks like. What is it actually like? Because they will simply not exist. They will always lose the evolutionary game. So, and then he involved some mathematicians to help him make sure that, everything is correct, and it was. And since the 80s, it's been a while, and they kind of developed it. And now they started playing with this idea that, okay, what happens if, from a technical standpoint, you put consciousness as a fundamental thing, and then you extrapolate everything else out of it? And they actually used, heavy mathematics to see if they can derive space-time, field equations, everything we understand about modern physics, quantum field theory, and they discovered that they can. And not only that they can, very often what happens is that equations that are a page long collapse into one line. So they are not only solving like functional problems in physics, but they're solving aesthetic problems in physics. And so this is where you start playing with this idea of like, wait a second, if you just change the perspective, you can actually get, and also from the Occam's razor perspective, which doesn't necessarily mean everything, of course, but it's a nice cherry on top. They're only asking for one miracle versus two, because right now we're asking for two miracles. We're asking for the Big Bang, everything out of nothing, and we're asking for the arising of emergence of consciousness somehow from inanimate matter, which seems to be impossible to describe. And I absolutely subscribe to David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, irreconcilable explanatory gap, because I don't think you can ever get to all of a sudden it's consciousness if you didn't start with some building blocks that are also conscious, or at least of that quality, right? But now you're only asking for one miracle. You're saying, yes, we don't know how, but somehow the mental is fundamental. Nice rhyme. But also, you now don't require the miracle of everything out of nothing, because you're just saying, okay, here we can give you, not philosophically, mathematically, we can give you everything, the field equations, everything comes into play, and we can go beyond space-time. They can actually describe now how space-time is not fundamental, It is an arising property of this deeper mental state. And I know it sounds super philosophical, but in this case, they're not treating it as philosophical. They're treating it very mathematically. So all of that, I know this is a lot to digest. So obviously I'll send you a couple of things to look at that are relatively short. I'm not going to, there's some conversations with these people that are like 4 hours long. I'm going to try and find something for like 10 minutes that is a nice clip by you drive home or something to get you interested. But I guess aside from it being fascinating and interesting, the relevant point that I was trying to make in relationship to your work, and for the obvious reasons, because what I discovered is, at the moment at least, rests entirely on people's observations, but it's a repeatable observation that people can talk about in real time. I do think that if science wants to move forward towards something that is truly what we consider futuristic, including very technical things like warp drive and technologies that go as wild as you want, we will have to figure out a way to inject the observer into the technical stuff, into the equations. You can no longer brush it under the rug. It is the most fundamental thing we know about. And I think that is the reason why you have to figure out a way to inject it into objective science, without which you wouldn't be able. In other words, you have to talk about particular states of mind that only these states of mind are capable of interacting with a thing like warp drive. Just like at the moment you can interact with this. Just like the dexterity of your fingers, it sounds like a lower, lower fruit example, but I think it delivers the point. The dexterity of our fingers versus the dexterity of other animals, even primates, is due to the particular mind that we have. And yes, this you can basically chuck to like the architecture of the brain. You're absolutely right, of course. But I'm making a slightly higher claim, which is that it's possible to postulate that the only way to be able to even interact physically, what we call physical, with certain kinds of technologies like warp drive or moving close to the speed of light, only if you have a particular mind that allows for that interaction. In other words, literally, even if you're going to have a spacecraft that can do it, you won't be able to go into it and do it because you don't have the particular mind that can perceive that function. So this is where the technical part starts playing a role. Because if the universe is mind, if you want to swim in particular waters of the more universal mind, you have to have certain, your bubble has to be able to fit into that part of the mind space. Otherwise, you literally cannot interact with these functions. And what I'm claiming is that these psychedelic experiences open the aperture of how much of how wide is your bubble in the universal mind, and it starts expanding. And final thing I'm going to say about that, I know I spoke for quite some time, but the final thing I want to say, because it makes it a lot easier to digest. They did a study with some people with altered personalities. I forget what the technical name for it is. You probably know, but people that have different personalities, right? And they called alters the different personalities. And what they discovered in some cases, this is documented, this is not some story, that if, let's say, somebody has 5 different personalities, which is rare that many, but it happens, and they dream a dream, in some cases, there are reports of when the different alters, the different personalities are present after they woke up, and you ask them about that dream, they all report the same dream from their own perspectives. And what's more, they saw each other in the dream. So it's one person with 5 personalities that had the same dream, each personality describing the same dream from their perspective, and they saw each other in the dream. And doesn't it remind you of the situation we're in right now? In other words, these boundaries, it just keeps fractaling this way. And then the universal mind is a little different because it doesn't have an external environment, and because it has no external environment, so it doesn't have this boundary problem that we do. So therefore, there is nothing that it's like to be it versus something else, and therefore there's no outward pointing vector, which eliminates any possibility for it having drive or goals or even self-awareness. So this is like some of the technical stuff which is why the universal mind, the experience of it is very different than what any mind inside of the universal mind would have. So it's a lot to put on the table, but I just want to kind of run it by you. So.
Yeah, that's really awesome. It's funny, the the mathematical framework that comes to mind for this is like linear algebra, just like spanning a new space, like spanning the space with basis vectors, right? So it's pretty cool. I've not I've not thought about it like that. That's pretty meta. Like it kind of yeah. I've
The
been
mother
stuck
of all
still
metas.
with, like, I've been stuck still with like the I'm still like on physics, right? Like metaphysics is the next thing to kind of unlock, and this sounds like that. So
Yeah,
I would love to learn
Hoffman is
more
starting
about
to tie it to like actual physics, which is in its infancy. And by the way, I completely understand. I mean, look, I have friends, also engineers, both electrical engineers and biochemical engineers, and I get it. Like I totally get it. That ultimately, when push comes to shove, when you have to do your work, it's not the same as like outlining some extravagant thing on TikTok. I understand that. You need to make sure that things work. In the end of the day, I get that. I guess the only proposition I'm making, maybe planting a seed, is that I do believe, and I need to think about it more, and probably maybe I need to put something on paper to make it more coherent, so so it's easier to digest how it exactly connects to something concrete and physical. But the general idea that I'm trying to deliver is I do believe that if by seeing it this way, we might be able to make progress that we couldn't before, which is, I would claim, the utilitarian function of this kind of thought. So like just like you can't do certain things if you just think about Newtonian physics. Well, in this case, you also describe it mathematically different, right? But unless you adopt Einstein's model of the world that talks about an actual space-time that bucks and weaves, you literally will, in extreme cases, will send trajectories that are going to be way off because you're literally not describing the right map, right? So in the same way, I'm claiming that, or that's my conviction, that if we adopt this new theoretical model, we'll be able to do things in the mind versus what we call the physical matter interaction, which is where we're all going, right? The Neuralink and all the other things. We would be able to construct things and to think about potential ways forward in a way that is much more accurate, because that is the truer outline of what's going on. That's my large proposition, and I'll do the due diligence and I'll write it down in a way that is much more concrete and maybe bullet points. So how specifically I want to deliver how I believe this frame can translate to something super functional in a lab that will allow you to think easier about these problems instead of thinking about it in terms of like all the trial and errors. That was my bigger point.
Yeah. Yeah, this is new to me. I mean, to be honest, it kind of reminds me of like Neo in the Matrix, right? Who's like, breaking out of the Matrix by, what it seems like him just thinking, or not thinking, but putting his, like hitting a higher state of consciousness that, permeates that manifold, right? And allows him to, define his own physics or manipulate it. Yeah, I mean, this is cool, but you're right. I think that, once you change that state of the observer, you open a lot, you kind of unlock a lot of capabilities, right? Yeah, I would love to see more of this, and
I will share some stuff with you for sure. And again, I'll do the due diligence to find kind of like the more to the point clips that talk about this the core of it. So then, if it is interesting, you can investigate further. But yeah, I do think that there's really something there, and I think that the paradigm shift is along these lines. But I do think that it will. At no point do I think that the scientific, the concrete scientific enterprise will somehow be replaced. I think that it's like Terence McKenna used to say. I mean, even if you suspect science, nobody in their right mind would suspect common sense. So, and really, science is the best way we found to inculcate common sense in an institution kind of way, really. So that's what it is, right? But yeah, I do think we need a better guiding frame for the thing, and I think idealism is actually a really good one, and specifically with what Hoffman is doing, which they dialed in something very concrete and mathematical. and then see if you can start translating that to something that's more actionable, like on an engineer level. That's already, it's a high toll, and I'm aware of the, you know, the big difference between talking about it even scientifically, theoretically, to then try and implement it in some kind of a device or a protocol that actually works. And I know that it's a much more difficult task. I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I'm a materialist in many ways because I try to make devices or software, and that's kind of like my space. But yeah, I mean, all this stuff's really super interesting. But
one final
yeah,
question for you. Sorry. Did you have these experiences? And you don't have to say if you don't want to, but did you have the spirit molecule experience?
I have not, but
Okay.
I'm from Peru, and one of the things that when I told my mom, "Hey, I'm going to be experimenting with these compounds," she's like, you're not doing it right. You know, you got to go to Peru. You got to do it. You know, with it, but the tourism in Peru, it's so hard to find what feels like a true, authentic practice of it, or at least like a safe practice of it. So that's
You have
I do.
authentic people here too, I assure you. I think that's an overly romanticized idea of people who want to always sell any other culture but ours as the authentic one. I mean, there's it's absolutely true that in some cases you have extreme, like, you know, a lineage thing where people, like, the entire tribe has been passing this on, the knowledge. I get it, that it is true. But I assure you that you can find people here. I'm not one of them. Just to be super clear, I'm not necessarily that great of a facilitator. I can do it, but what I'm saying is that I know for sure in this region of our little world, there are definitely people who are very, very, very good at you know, creating the structure, facilitating, and all of that stuff. So you don't necessarily have to travel to some shaman in either in
Yeah,
Peru or the Amazon.
that's
Yeah.
good to hear because I did find someone that I really like in Mexico, and they're practitioners of five, and I know it's a very different, totally different experience. One of them targets the 5-HT1A, and the other one is a 2A, and one of them is, you know, completely disassociating, and the other one is, from what I hear, hyper grounding, right? Like you're more present and grounded than you've ever been, is what I'm told. And I've only experimented with the kind of classical stuff that's
Yeah.
pretty readily available.
Well, again, we can talk about it more in detail, and I could potentially help you find somebody. But I do think that, well, you know what? That's a great experiment. I guess time will tell. I have to be very honest that at the moment, it's not much more than a very strong conviction based on a lot of my experience. But as I always say, we got almost everything wrong for 2 million years, so the chances that this is also wrong are very high. So only time will tell if I'm correct about that. But I do think that it's one of these things which is literally like moving from Newton to Einstein. Like, you would be able to do things that you couldn't before, even in terms of like technical research. So we'll see. We'll find out if that is in fact true. And by the way, your focus, the thing you were describing with the trying to go through Shulgin's work and all that stuff, this is something you've done in the past, or this is something you're currently doing?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of machine learning for various chemical systems, never for something as complex as consciousness. It's a pretty wild black box, and there's probably layers of black boxes within that black box. But really, it's been an area that I've been very passionate about, just because when the pandemic hit, I think, like many people, that isolation just really puts you in like a rabbit hole, and digging myself out of it was very complicated. And I ended up experimenting with a lot of these compounds, and you know, there were some moments where I felt like I was maybe doing more harm than good, but then there were some moments as well where I felt like, wow, that was easy. That was like, it was just a perspective shift. Like, it was literally like everything clicked and made sense, and then I kind of got over a few things. But for the most part, I wanted to kind of do research on therapeutics in this space, and that's where I started talking to a lot of professors in this space. One of them, he's at Caltech, and he has been studying like nicotine pathways, serotonin pathways, and recently there's been a breakthrough in the serotonin literature where they always thought that SSRIs were just working by preventing the reuptake of serotonin, and that slowly brings your body or your mind into a high serotonin state. But really it's doing a lot of other, it doesn't work immediately, right? It takes 30 days or so for people to equilibrate. And what is happening is a lot of other pathways, one called brain-derived nootropic factor, I think it is. BDNF is the short abbreviation for it, but it's a profile of these molecules that have to increase in the mind, and that helps people. But even things like, what I'm trying to say is, even the therapeutics that we have invented and been implementing for the past 20 or 30 years are just being understood today. And so when it comes to some of these serotonin therapies, it's become very inspiring to kind of take on that and try to kind of understand it. And once you understand it, we have these like data points, right? We have certain compounds that nature has given us, and you can kind of throw those into the black box and you get a certain output. And the question then goes, well, but there's an infinite number of compounds that you can put in between those data points, right? That you can make. And what is the output?
But they actually use AI for this now, to actually try and come up with new
totally.
compounds. Yeah.
Yeah,
great.
totally. And even stuff like, Google's DeepMind, right, where they're able to model like how these proteins fold and the shape of them, really gives a lot of powerful insights into how these receptors are shaped and how you could potentially design a molecule for that. And so it's a very cool area. I've encountered a lot of people that just think it's like this is sacred, this is natural, like why synthesize a tool for it, or why play God almost, right? Like this, like the God molecule is what it is. We have it. There is no other alternative therapy. But
What do you mean by that? Can you extrapolate on that?
Yeah, just like I think there's like purism, like in this space where it's like,
I see.
we have certain molecules are derived from nature that are deemed to be safe, although I kind of think that's kind of silly. That's just because nature has given it to us doesn't mean it's...
Yeah, I always say, there's a lot, most things in nature will kill you. It's just like it. There's nothing, the naturalistic fallacy, right? And also, and also it's naturalistic fallacy from the other end, because everything that exists in the universe is natural, including what we make, plastic, all of it. That's not a good distinction.
I totally agree with you. It's all natural. Like what we make is natural.
It's the universe doing it. What do you think? The irony is that when people say that, they somehow place us in a special place. They say we are so special that we're outside of nature, which is the opposite of what the sentiment they're trying to invoke. It's just like, no, you're literally, this is the universe doing whatever you're doing. Like, this is it, right?
But I get it though. I get it. Like there's like, I love the idea that there's this ancient plant wisdom or intelligence that is telling the shamans what to mix, and that will ever be a huge mystery. Like, how did some of these brews become formulated? Like, from my perspective as a scientist, I'm like, there's no way someone came up with that. Like, that's crazy. But especially when my perspective of this whole thing is so caveman or meathead, right, compared to what's actually happening. It's just very humbling, but at the same time, I agree with you. It's all natural, and it doesn't have there is no special kind of like there's no special power that comes from something that is plant derived versus human derived.
Oh man. And I forgot, I wanted to say something about this. What was the minutes?
I don't know if I have a main point.
Okay.
I think I'm just experimenting. Yeah, try to use machine learning to make to try to find a way to make molecules that can work. But that's only one of the projects within kind of this framework. We can talk offline about like my larger project, but this is definitely kind of in line. It does fit within it. But a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, that on this chat, on this on these lives, of just like questioning the fundamental framework that we're all operating in. This is something that I've been studying for a very long time, and it feels like we're finally getting somewhere as a species.
Yeah, well, to be honest, my hubris is a little bigger than that. I'm not claiming to question, I'm claiming to know something. And that is and I understand it's much more radical, but I've arrived here after, over a decade of analyzing this thing. And now I think that I have something that actually holds water and it can take the pressure. So it's not so much that I need to prove something, is that I think I have something so concrete that science can't ignore it. But the challenge now is to basically convince to pass that first bar of actually putting it into a lab where it's deemed important enough to actually study. And I know we'll get there, but that's just to be, to do like to do all the necessary to make all the necessary statements about the truth about how I think I'm coming at it. I don't think I'm as humble as saying, hey guys, did you think about this? I'm saying, no, here's what I know for sure, and you should look at this. So that's kind of like my position. And actually, that's an important question that Cal asked. He asked, what is a good thought experiment that one could focus on with idealism? And that's something that Bernardo Kastrup, a thought experiment Bernardo Kastrup gave, which is that the mistake that most modern scientists make, that most of them fall under the physicalist perspective for the obvious reasons, is that they don't even realize that they basically believe in magic. And here's a way to illustrate this. So basically they're saying, look, we don't understand how consciousness is arising. We know for sure, which is the mistake, that it's somehow an arising property of just physical matter doing whatever it's doing. And the mistake is that they just, because it's complex and because it has some mysterious functions attached to it in quantum physics, somehow you jumble this whole thing together, magic happens, you have consciousness. That's literally the proposition. Most of them will not admit that that's a proposition, but you don't have a way around that. That is the proposition. Because, and here's a way to illustrate it with the thought experiment, all the brain is an electrochemical system. The physical brain, okay? It's folded in a very, very incredible, intricate way, but all it is interactions between an electrical impulse that then invoke a reaction from a chemical reaction that then essentially sends a molecule, a neurotransmitter, from one end of the synapse to the other, and then when it captures it, when it docks, then it releases another electrical reaction. So it's just basically a very, very elaborate game of dominoes that is made out of electric signals and chemical bouncing of a ball, so for simple language. And he uses this example with the ball to illustrate the next point. Imagine that you and I are throwing a ball at a basketball. You and I are throwing a basketball. Of course, we don't think that consciousness will arise from you and I throwing a basketball back and forth, which is essentially what your neurons are doing. But then imagine 5 people doing that, and then imagine 1,000 people doing that, and then you go. And then imagine trillions of people, if you can imagine that, standing and all passing a basketball to one another in different. Do you now think that because there's so many of them, somehow this system of people passing basketballs to each other will produce some kind of a mind made out of these passing basketballs? If you do, you think the same thing as modern scientists. But there's no reason to think that. That's the equivalent of believing in magic. Or at least it is the lack of recognition that there's something here that you're not explaining. You're explaining it away by saying it's how it is, which is a mistake that very often scientists make, by the way, as well, which is kind of crazy to me, because they go on this whole tangent for 30 minutes on some podcasts about how they discovered something new, and then they, again, of course, hit some kind of a rock bottom of not knowing, and then they say, oh, and these are naturally occurring. Wait, what? What do you mean? What is naturally occurring? You mean it's just how it is? So you didn't explain anything, you just said how it is. That's descriptive, that's not explanatory. Your job is to explain. I think you forgot that part. So that is exactly the, where the problem lies, yeah.
I agree with you. It is mind blowing. And it does feel there's a ton of magic, not just with this, but like even what you mentioned before, where like we have to accept that everything just arose from nothing, right? That's one that kind of I don't like. But one thing that I've been really impressed by is just neural networks, right? Like we don't understand how they work, especially the deep ones. They're very convoluted, and especially when you have nonlinear activation functions, it's like you can't keep track of all the bits flowing through a deep neural network. But I was working on I made a neural network to essentially determine if two images are similar to each other, right? This is something that scientists do in a lab. You develop, like, by staring at enough data, you develop like an eye for something, right? Where you look at it and you're like, yeah, that looks good or that looks bad. And it's really frustrating because from a programming perspective, you want to quantify what that is, and you try to quantify it by like very mathematical terms, like fitting a function and then quantifying some parameter. But a deep neural network can give you can quantify that similarity that a human eye can, which I've been kind of blown away by, because I don't have a mathematical description for why something is like a similar or not similar, but these neural networks can do it. So I think the brain is a collection of neural networks from various different systems, right? From your visual to your auditorial to tons of sensory inputs. And I am curious if I agree that all of this seems like it can't be emergent. It seems like too good to be true if all this does emerge from little gooey neurons that are firing, right? But I am also hopeful that it's something that works. Like even today, the way that they're talking about making microchips now, it's not about cramming as many transistors into a square centimeter as possible. It's about changing the architecture of these transistors into networks now. And that's gonna unlock this entire Moore's law that we've been stuck on, right? We're now at 3 nanometer transistors. We have quantum effects. We have error. We don't have the material science to create a quantum system that's stable at room temperature to go smaller. But we now unlocked, you can make a network and completely, like, our stuff looks like caveman now, right? Our processors are just shitty now.
Yeah.
And so it's like so crazy that is it makes me feel like we're so stupid as a species that like we're just making these realizations. But it's also very humbling to kind of understand. But I totally like my optimism, and like there's this like spiritual component to all this. That like, how is spirituality an emergent phenomenon, but there is a part of me that wants this idealism to be real, right? There's this like romantic part of me that really is attracted to that.
Yeah, but I'm with you that functionally it's also important. So like I actually approaching these things, maybe because when you get older, you kind of because you understand that your time is limited. You try and allocate more brain power to things that are functionally relevant versus just the things that make you feel good about their existence, which you can still hold some of these. But I'm actually coming at this from can we do something with it that is important for the evolution of humanity? That's how I'm thinking about these problems. The business, good to see you, brother. I haven't seen you in a while. I think ultimately what you have, if you're in the game, so I think recognizing what game you're playing is the important part. You playing the engineering game, which is a very well-defined game in terms of it either works or it doesn't. If it doesn't, I have to modify things for it to work. My job is to make it work. I might postulate when I go home about some interesting things beyond space-time, whatever. But if I can't fold it into a functioning prototype of something, it's outside of the bounds of what I should be thinking about because it's not what I do, right? But what I feel like is happening very often with people who do take on the job of explaining the whole thing, and include especially the people who work on like theoretical physics and like the picture of everything, they seem to forget that part, that is their job. Their job is not to describe how certain things are. It's part of understanding the larger picture, but they literally took up upon themselves to explain what is going on, right? And that is a very different kind of project. And I guess I just feel like when they get to a dead end and then they go, oh, and then that just happens. I'm like, whoa, sorry, buddy, that's not what you do. I think you forgot that. Say I don't know, but don't say it's just naturally occurring, because that's not a legal move on the chessboard that you chose to play on. And that is the only thing that I guess I'm addressing with these kind of like statements, when people just brush it under the rug and they say, oh, like for example, I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a brilliant physicist, and this is how I know it doesn't come from any kind of. He actually has like his ego totally in check. He's a longtime meditator, one of the most humble people I've ever met. So I know it's not necessarily an ego thing. It's just almost like a blind spot, because you're so smart, and usually there's not a lot of people in the world that can police you, because there's not a lot of people in the world that can even pay attention to what you're doing. But I basically asked him about about a simple thing, about the fact that Conway's game of life even works, right? And I was like, well, give me one process in physics that would make sense of the fact that when you give these simple 4 rules in a computational grid, somehow you get these like super complex structures emerging. Or for that matter, any cellular automata that actually is doing something. Like, explain that to me in terms of physics. And he went on a roundabout for like 20 minutes about going through this and through Planck scale and Planck time, and the only logical natural scale that we should talk about and all that stuff. And then we came back to the same point. I was like, okay, how does that explain the fact that when you give these 4 rules, it gives rise to these complex structures? And then he bent over a little bit more, and I was like, well, come on. How is it explaining the 4 rules? Can't you see that it points to some fundamental thing that is happening in existence that allows for this to happen? And if the postulation is, well, this does not require an explanation because we can just say it's just how it is, well, now you lost the game, because that's not the game you're playing. You have to explain it in terms of prior causes, which is what reductionism is, which is most physics is reductionist. So if you want to go the reductionist, you have to tell me what prior steps give rise to the logical unfoldment of these 4 rules giving rise to all these complex structures. And if you can't, then either you call this a law of physics, because that's one part of your axioms, which is fine, but then again, still all the laws of physics, this is the meta assumption, that if you're going to play the game of the theory of everything, you must first understand that whatever shape it's going to take, it's going to have to explain itself. It's going to have to. You're not going to get out of that problem. You will have to describe some kind of a rule or a function or something that by definition gives rise to itself. Good luck with that. And we can say, look, we're always going to have the horizons of the current axioms, which is true. The only thing I'm always blown away by, which is then the language that is used is not, okay, these are the current dialed in regularities that we just don't know how to explain in terms of anything else. It is framed in terms of, this is just a given. Because if you're willing to accept a given, then you're in the wrong game. Anyways, I'm going in circles, but it's just like a big pet peeve of mine when people say that, especially from the perspective of physicists.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, actually. I do, I do appreciate that a lot, because that is something that I think a lot of physicists fail on, and it's a very obvious kind of point. Yeah, that's amazing, man. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to share some of these things from with you, because who knows? Like, listen, if this even gives you like a slight inspiration and do something great for all of humanity, that would be amazing.
Yeah, totally.
The business.
But,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually get some dinner. Thank you for having me on today. It's been,
brother.
This is one of my favorite talks. A lot of cool topics are touched on. Yeah, please send me over any literature. I'll be happy to read it.
Absolutely. I might start with a couple of videos and then I'll find the literature. And actually, I'm gonna jump off in less than a minute too. So perfect timing. Enjoy dinner. You're always a blessing, brother. You're amazing.
Likewise.
And the business says, I'm heading to London now to find more of us. That's great. Send them our way. So we're all gonna do it. Nico, enjoy dinner, brother. What are else without correspond? What are your prior steps with that? What is a hamster without a wheel? What is it? Wait, there's no space, so there's no wheel, brother. Okay, guys. So I'm also gonna. My dog is. She hates me because I was dragging her. She probably needed to go to the bathroom for like an hour. Sending love to everybody. Thank you so much. If you're on TikTok, check out my YouTube channel, Dango Thoughts, DANGO Thoughts, 3 words. Or just follow the link tree on the top on my channel. And I'll see you everybody tomorrow. And that's it. Tomorrow, hopefully, we'll do it in a normal time. Peace and love, everybody. Everybody on YouTube, give a like if you can. Love you all. Peace and love. So long, YouTube and X and Twitch, and I'll see you tomorrow. If you can give this live a like, I would highly appreciate it. Have a good night. Peace and love.